You are listening to the Mary Jane Society podcast, where you will meet entrepreneurs, cultivators, scientists, doctors, and inventors in the cannabis industry.
Welcome. I'm your host, Pam Schmiel. Today we're discussing cannabis extraction with industry expert Murphy Murri. She's been working in extraction since the early days of legalization in Colorado and has built a reputation as a go-to expert in both solventless and BHO techniques. She helps extraction teams optimize their operations, develop new products, and write SOPs to ensure efficiency and quality. In this episode, we discuss how extractors can fine-tune their processes to preserve important compounds that are easily destroyed, as well as why more brands should apply sensory science to their R&D for next-level product development. Let's welcome Murphy Murri to the show.
Your background in cannabis and what you're doing today, just to get us started. Be great.
Sure. I have been working in the legal industry starting in Colorado since 2009, that's early days for Colorado. We had the medical program, but it was the caregiver model, and the dispensaries that were open were an extension of the caregiver model. So it was basically caregivers with a office lease. And in 2010 is when licensing first was developed for the state of Colorado. So I've been doing it since then, basically. And that initial round of licensing is the first time we saw vertical integration, which as a mandate, right? And from a manufacturing perspective, that is not how most things are made. But cannabis was. And so vertical integration meant that in order to sell it, you had to grow it. And, that was born out of the caregiver model where one grower could have, many patients for whom he serviced, rather than imposing every individual patient be involved in their own cultivation. And so I got involved walking into, the caregiver model at the retail end. And I was like, great, this is easy. I can turn this into a real business. I was 21. So I had no fear of risk because I didn't have any assets. There's absolutely nothing to lose at that age. And so I didn't recognize the gift in the way that I do look back on now, where I'm like, how lucky and how random. Because I would have stayed at that patient level because I loved it. I was in Vail, Colorado. So I was, I wasn't in the hustle and bustle of the city. I got to know all of my patients, like our average transaction probably took us 25 minutes. I would roll your joints for you. Like you would pick it from the jar and I would roll it. It was just such a different thing. But then I immediately, a year later, I'm getting thrown into, we have to grow it ourselves. So I have to figure out how to build and operate commercial grows, and I have to figure out how to build and operate labs and kitchens. And so at the time, I was part of a group of people where we had a bunch of different experts, people playing their roles, but we were all forced to form a conglomerate, get married overnight, no dating, just arranged marriages. And, they didn't all work out. A lot of marriage ends in divorce, right? And so every time there was a hole, I just had to jump in and fix it. And so I started in the retail end, and I, managing the grow was very logistical and compliance oriented for me. I grew up Mormon, growing stuff, having to string the beans and jar the pickles was like a chore and like a punishment in my mind growing up. And so the idea of going to a grow for work, I didn't even appreciate, because I was like, chores, I liked the I liked the more glamorous side of things. I love being in the lab. I love being able to make stuff. Because as much as I don't like the repetition of stuffing a bunch of jars of pickles, I love coming up with a new brine and a new flavor. I love like that, inventive process. Yeah. And it's so fast. The cultivation is slow. You make a decision today and you wait 4 months to be proven right or wrong, or you wait 2 weeks to be proven right or wrong. And I can do stuff in the lab in 4 minutes, 2 hours. If I have to wait a week for something, I'm making a PowerPoint to complain about it in the next meeting, you know, like I get such instant gratification in the lab. And so I ended up in the lab sort of by accident, out of necessity, because we had a location in one spot where we were doing edibles and we were trying to do extracts. And at that time, the regulations were being written as we go. So something that was compliant today could be non-compliant the next day in terms of zoning, because these rules are just being written. And each municipality can make their own. So what was true in Boulder may not be true in Denver, may not be true in, you know, Eagle Vale. You know, there was places doing moratoriums and banning things. So I just got this crazy crash course on like building codes, zoning, political corruption, government inefficiency, and how everything just has a cost. But through all of that, I was able to really keenly identify that manufacturing is where all of your margin is at. And so if, you know, the cultivation has a huge opportunity to succeed or fail in like these pretty dramatic terms, but as long as you could get to the finish line in a grow, some money can be made. And in the manufacturing, you just have this huge opportunity to squeeze every last drop of goodness out or ruin everything, you know, aggressively. And I loved that. I love that like opportunity within the industry. Like I said, at the time, it was just like, this is where I had to be. And that drug me out of the mountains. I had to come down to Denver because you can't be manufacturing far away from where the distribution happens. And so I got into the lab sort of just as the industry expanded and developed. I started with bubble hash, and it was hash edibles. And by that, I mean, we just made hash and put it in edibles. Like there was not a lot of
Formulation
anything
or,
that, you know, like they were called extra strong or regular strength. And we determined that by putting the same amount of hash in each batch and then trying them. And if it's stronger than usual or about the same,
oh
which
my,
I was proud of, you know, I was like, look what we're doing. We're telling you when it's a little stronger, because we didn't even have testing, you know, that wasn't even a thing. And the testing we did have would have been like for flour, you know. So we were just all growing up together. And because I was young and, you know, didn't know how crazy it was, I was just pretty willing to jump in and do a lot of things. So I pretty quickly, once I got into a lab space, you know, and we started making more edibles, I was like, well, this can improve. You know, I did have that that upbringing of, you know, manufacturing foods yourself to know like, oh, we could do better than just putting some hash and like mixing as hard as we can, you know. And so and so that's where I got into solvent based extraction. You know, and I started with butane and propane sort of in like even Facebook was quite new. You know, we're still talking 2010, 2011. So we didn't have a lot of resources to see what other people were doing. And what we did see was largely about cultivation and genetics. And it was so easy at that time, easier even than now, to just cop out on genetics and say that's a bad strain. And then just like, you know, just give it up and say you can't process that into anything good. And so we just had this, you know, this pursuit of genetics, which is good. You should pursue good genetics. But we did it in a way where we were able to put the entire quality of anything that came out of it on the genetic. And as extraction went from this sort of crude process that still had some of the weed left over in it, essentially. So yeah, the weed needed to be good because it was still all the way in that final product. As that got purer and purer and purer, I was able to, like I said, this is where the margin is, take advantage of getting what's good out of material that isn't as good, which was really important in Colorado because we were running out of material all of the time. By the time recreational was passed, you know, there was just, you couldn't grow enough, you couldn't get enough, and the price was really high. And so being able to manipulate, you know, our cost efficiency without having to sacrifice product quality was, you know, sort of my mission for a really long time. And so from there, I just got really into the butane and propane extraction. like I said, rules and regulations change all the time. So the extractor I built myself out of parts became non-compliant overnight, and I had to go buy extractors from other people. That's how I met Extraction Tech. I had been buying pumps from them, and I started buying their equipment and ended up working with them, doing a whole bunch of training. And so I, did the operator training for everyone who bought their systems for the next couple of years once that was being mandated, which was a really cool experience that I think most people won't ever get again, because I got to be there, in the room talking to people who are experts in their craft, that are the most experienced person in their business at the job they're doing. And they're coming in saying everything I was doing before, I'm not allowed to do anymore. They have to start over. And I had to work back, how to achieve what they were achieving before with equipment that's completely different, which was just, certainly a lesson I couldn't have, gone to school for, because it was nothing but trial and error, but through so many different people's eyes. And I got to see so many different labs. And, that led me into consulting, where I just got to do that fun part of the problem solving every day for everyone else. Because again, I love to come up with the pickle plan. But, after the first 100 jars or so, I'm out. I want someone else to come in. I want a robot to come in and automate the rest of that process as soon as it can be repeated. I want to move on to the next project. And so that's essentially where I'm at today. I've got ownership in a couple of licensed facilities, but for the most part, I offer consulting and training for people on their current products, whether it's like writing their SOP backwards from a product they already have, or helping them develop a new product with intention, or training their staff on how to continue making that product with the same equipment, new equipment, optimizing the process, really just
Yes.
troubleshooting.
So you have ownership in a couple extraction facilities?
Yeah. I've got ownership in some cultivation licenses as well, but I like I said, I prefer the lab. And so yeah, I'm a co-owner of some facilities here in Colorado, as well as a hemp business, which does a lot of like isolates and formulations, especially for dogs. We like the dog stuff. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Ooh, that might be another topic down the road. I've always been wanting
Yeah.
to also, yeah, the whole veterinarian and horses too. I mean,
Right.
I heard that's like a whole nother area that people have had success
Yeah. I
looking
mean,
at.
we have all the same problems for product formulation for pets as we do for humans, but then they're exacerbated by the fact that at least humans can tell us when it tastes bad, when it smells
Yeah,
bad, when it gives them a stomach ache. They can
yeah.
communicate their discomfort in a way that the animals can't always. And so, your ability to be really specifically effective is so nuanced from,
Yeah.
animal to animal and condition to condition. But I'm obsessed with it because, of course, if it's a safer medicine for us, why wouldn't it be for our dogs? And
Mm,
if you think the pharmaceuticals that get, you know, passed and approved for humans are reckless, you don't want to know, the compromises that they make for pets, because, it's
right.
that efficacy equation. Like, yes, it will destroy their liver, but if they only live 10 years and we give them 2 years, then, the math
Mhm,
adds up.
mhm.
And so the
Yeah,
quality of life angle, oh, it's just so important. And, I can't wait. I
yeah,
can't wait for
especially
the
since,
science to back up the vets, because
right,
they
right.
they
I
are up
know there's
against the
not a
same
lot being
scrutiny.
done in that area, I think. And also animals, I don't want to get off the subject, but animals are so prone, dogs are so prone to anxiety and cancer. And those
Of
are two
course.
things that are, I mean, cancer, we're still learning, but I just feel like
Right.
on the road there will be some, cannabis-based medicine for that. So let's hope for that. But going on
Yeah.
to extraction, I know that BHO is your preferred extraction, right? From what I've heard you say in the past. And I guess if you could just talk to us why you think that is, and is it because of efficiency of scale instead of doing, cold water hash or, solventless process? Is that just the best alternative? That's
Right.
what I think of BHO, but
Yeah.
why is
I
that
would
the best
say
kind?
it always comes back to like, what's your goal? What are you trying to accomplish, for starters? And, part of that question requires you to honestly evaluate your input material.
Mm,
And the quality of the input material, of course, matters, right? The better it is, the better everything else, of course. However, it just always isn't gonna be great material. I
yeah.
wish that were true. But I know how hard it is to run a large scale cultivation and put out high quality material. Having tried and finding that process annoyingly difficult, I have sympathy and compassion for the growers. I still want to have my high standards, but the larger you scale up, the harder it is to maintain that level of quality. And so, if you have high quality, you can look at your processing from, rudimentary, minimal handling and do something like solventless. And the better your material is, the better those results will be. And then the rest of your yield you can look at as a byproduct. But if the quality of the input material isn't top tier, then, to give up so much of your product stream as a byproduct, and to waste is just not feasible. The way we can afford to grow better weed next time is often by making sure we monetize. And I always say, no cannabinoids left behind. You might not get the aromas and the flavors, you might not get the nutritional diversity of flavonoids, and anthocyanins. You may have to skip certain categories, but you don't have to skip the cannabinoids. That's the one thing cannabis can provide that the other products and ingredients you can buy can't. It is a little silly to buy cocoa butter when you are, winterizing waxes and fats out of cannabis that could be used the way you use cocoa butter. But because cocoa butter is an option, it's okay to sacrifice those waxes for these. But with cannabinoids, you don't have another outlet. So no cannabinoids left behind is always, my first goal. And that's where, solvent-based processing is, of course, going to be superior because we can be, a little bit more targeted in our approach. But it is always a decision. You can decide to exclude good stuff that is there or to destroy it, or, you can target each category individually. And this is where butane and propane I love as a solvent system compared to things like ethanol or CO2, because since butane and propane are refrigerants, it is in their nature to be cold when they are a liquid. And so the amount of energy they contain as a pressurized, volatile, combustible, dangerous solvent prevents me from having to put energy into the process. And the less you have to interact with the process, probably the more consistent it will be, because humans are errors. We are error machines. We are usually the interference in any given process. And so since butane and propane are likely to cycle themselves the way your air conditioner works, they go from high pressure to low pressure. If you heat them, the pressure rises and they'll be drawn to the cold. So they have a very predictable way of functioning, which is really beneficial to the cannabinoids and to the other desirable compounds. Because since it's inherently cold, for example, if you want to get CO2 to go from a vapor to a liquid, you heat it. A hot process is going to heat a lot of those compounds. And for aromatics, for waxes, for flavonoids, for fats that can break down or spoil, we have all of these things that heating won't be good for. Anything that you can extract cold is going to just give you a little bit more time and space to make more decisions with that product down the road. And in that way, you can extract everything that's there and then break it all into its pieces. And then, of course, have the responsibility to make good choices now of which to keep and which to let go. And this is where, each manufacturer has to, have that real mission statement, like a real one, an actionable one that says, we're going to care about quality, even if it means rinsing one more time, or we're going to care about yield and get the weight and never rinse the extra times and be honest with themselves about it. Because if it's going into food, it's okay for there to be a little bit of extra fats and waxes. And if it's going to be inhaled, maybe we want to get the heavier waxes out of the way so that people aren't inhaling and, creating that dense mist that we don't have any data on. So I love butane and propane because it gives you the most opportunity. Since it's not heated, you can get all of your cannabinoids in their acidic form and essentially in whatever form they're present in the plant in. So, you know, anytime you don't decarb yet, you always still can. So that also just gives you the broadest potential range of products you can make. Because once you've decarbed, there's certain things you just can't undo. And you can undo them, but that's an amount of chemical processing that I think is better for us to not do. The less you touch it, the better.
When you separate all these compounds in the BHO extraction process, and then you recreate them again, or take some pieces that you want, I guess, is that how you,
It's
just in different liquid?
kind of, yeah, theoretically, there should be a moment when you're developing your process where you do map it out and say, here's what I have, here's what I started with, here's the potential stuff that's in it. You know, you just test it for potency, test it for terpene content, test it for everything that you can. And you say, this is what I could potentially get out of it. And then you can, you know, try different versions of processing to see how close you get. So, you know, for starters, let's say that your flower is 20% cannabinoids. If you get a 20% yield by weight and it's not 100% cannabinoids, you've left some behind in the material. Or let's say you get a 30% yield on that 20% input material. Now you have more weight. So what is the other 10%? Is it the 2% terpenes, or is there still some terpenes on the material left over? Is it mostly fats? Is it water that you've squeezed out of it? Is that extra weight solvent that we now need to remove? And so you can operate your system, depending on the system, at different temperatures and at different pressures to control what you're dissolving and capturing. You can also implement different filtration mechanisms. So some of that might be by particle size, like solventless is all about particle size, and we're just capturing, you know, what holds back on the filter. This would be the opposite. We're capturing what goes through the filter. And you can also implement, people will often just refer to it as media, but these are basically dry powders, similar to what you'd use for chromatography. Some of these powders absorb moisture. Some of them have an affinity for more polar compounds like chlorophyll, like anthocyanins, you know, plant leafy stuff, right? And some of them can actually be targeted for removing pesticides or heavy metals. And all of this is a decision you make as you go. So the temperatures you operate, the pressure, the speed at which you go, how much solvent you expose, how much volume of cannabis to, these are all decisions you make in your process. So if you're the person who designed the process, you decided what compromises you wanted to make, because everything requires a compromise. Maybe I want to get 100% of my yield and 100% of my quality, then I'm going to invest more time at minimum. And if it's not more time, it's more energy, because I'm spending more money implementing a bunch of automation and extra components. Maybe you're willing to give up a little bit of the yield in order to get that quality faster. Maybe you're willing to give up a little bit of the quality in order to get the yield and go faster. At each, you know, like that quality triangle, right? You have to decide which one do you want to bend on. And so if you're just the employee who gets hired and they say, do this, you maybe don't have a lot of decision making in that process. But somewhere, someone wrote an SOP, and that SOP is a reflection of what compromises the business was willing to make, whether they were on yield, on quality, or on, you know, cost, which would include time and energy and their total investment in that process.
So let's talk about sensory science, which not many people are talking about, but you hear about it here and there. And how can it be used in the extraction process to maybe manipulate, you know, the plant for a better end product? Like what
Yeah,
would
I
it,
think
you could just talk to us about that, and how does that even work into the R&D? It's what, like how does it all work
sure.
into this? Yeah.
Well, you know, R&D for the cannabis industry has always sort of been a research and development under the umbrella of selling it afterwards. And so to do real R&D, usually you don't have to sell the outcome of it to afford the process of developing it. So for a lot of cannabis, we made a thing and we worked backwards to justify it. Sensory science is how we did that. In this, like I mentioned before, I had extra strength and regular strength, and that was the sensory science of we ate it. Did it taste better or worse than normal than the last time we had one? Did it get me higher or less high than the last time I had one? And I just had to take that on a person by person basis. And so sensory science, we all engage in one-on-one. Some people love the smell of vanilla and some people don't, and some people will take it just in the right amount. Everyone's kind of got their Goldilocks sensory machine that's built into them. And so to make that data more robust is where the sensory science comes in, is how do we collect enough of it to be able to use it more objectively rather than subjectively. And so, especially when we think about the input material, using more sensory science would be critical so that we're making the right choices with this material. Some processes are better for pure isolation of cannabinoids, and some processes are better for, preserving aromas, but only under certain conditions. For example, the freshness of the flower has a lot to do with how much potential post-processing and filtration and cleanup you're going to have to do. And so sometimes if we just compromise to make sure that we were always processing faster and maybe storing and batching things up to do further post-processing in the future so that we don't leave it as old flower all the time, would be really valuable. When I look at like the total yeast and mold type of issues that people are having in the industry, a lot of that is just that we didn't build to store. We thought we'd sell it faster. We thought we'd package it faster. We thought we'd move it faster. We thought we'd get the test back faster. We didn't build the storage infrastructure. And so, we created a problem that we didn't used to have. And there's a lot in processing that I think we can avoid if we are able to, be better judges in sort of sorting and qualifying material. A lot of people are going to have their opinions of good or bad material, but if you go into a given manufacturing facility, the value of that material is going to vary depending on who you ask. Some people in a manufacturing facility are going to value different material based on how much it costs them to buy. And some of them are going to value it differently based on how good it smells when they open the bag. And some of them are going to value it differently based on if they have to grind it up or not, if it's really hard for them to prepare and get ready in the socks for extraction or not. Some people are going to have preferences based on the total potency, so everyone's going to kind of have a different understanding of what quality is, and quality gets used as this nebulous term to define all of those things, to define the actual cost value, the physical characteristics, the observable characteristics, the chemical characteristics. And so for quality to be more actionable, this is where sensory science needs to take up its own little chunk of that, so that your cost control can be a part of your quality analysis, but doesn't show up on the same, spreadsheet as the one where we're saying, what was our total potential aromatic content? What was, the total potential flavor profile that was, capable of being preserved? And did we preserve it? A lot of times we can't even test for these compounds until we are already at the final product stage. So we don't know how we did. I could get a 1% yield on flavonoids and feel great about it, but what if there was 5%?
Yes.
Then that's terrible news,
Right. I was just reading a paper by Abstracts, a white paper that was saying that the flavorants usually get burned out or are lost, that they don't end up in the end product. But what if we could keep them? They're responsible for aromatics and could add so much, to the end product. So
and what's great is the answers to those kinds of questions do benefit all those same people that I mentioned. The person who cares about, the cost of the material and the yield they're going to get wants to know that there's 5% extra yield of another byproduct that we've been leaving out. And maybe that 5% doesn't go into your vape cartridges, but it goes into your gummies. And your marketing department would love to be able to flex a COA for flavonoids. That would be great. But if you leave it behind in the material and you throw it away, or if you extract it all and then you invest time in filtering it out and then throw it away, like you get all these opportunities to stop and test as you go. And a lot of times we get hung up on the compliance angle. And so we look at observable physical characteristics like what is our potency? And are we getting closer to the color we were expecting? Are we getting closer to the price point we were expecting, to the cost per gram that we were expecting? If we don't bring, the sensory data in, it wouldn't, a lot of people will look at the cost of running, these colder processes or a slower process or gentler process. And they'll say, well, I can't, get the flour for cheap enough. They get hung up on one angle versus another. And they aren't able to actually break it down and say, okay, well, yes, this material costs more, but it yields more and then sells for a higher price point. So it actually is more.
Yeah.
And if you can't go piece by piece, you'll miss that very easily.
Right.
And so I think that's where the sensory, other industries will do that with their grading and their quality. And we have just not really standardized that. A lot of times it's very hard to even figure out the actual harvest date for the material unless you're clicking backwards in metric and, you have that seed to sale system in place. And so you don't even know how fresh it is.
So what would that take then? Is it more equipment? I mean, it's analyzing obviously, but we'd have to analyze when the plant, before it goes to the extraction process or maybe after the curing process, once you brought some other, elements.
A lot of it is just a little bit more transparency in the batch tracking, because a lot of what we look for in batch tracking, again, just comes from a regulatory compliance angle. So it's all about how many grams did I have and how much THC was in it. If we step backwards and said, what was the aromatic content the day that it went into the storage facility and what was it when it came out, that facility would then be able to be held accountable for their storage temperatures, because you could see when and where they lost it. And so some of that is just, that's an analytical test where we can send out for, and we can say, here's where we started, here's where we ended. Most people only test at the end. If you don't know where you started, you can't track it. And so what you want is the at the start and at the end. And then now you can bring in the subjective, personal experience to say, here's one where we lost it. Here's one where we kept it. So identical numbers and a change in the numbers. And then we can get the personal feedback of how important is it? How far can we go away from perfect numbers? How much can we compromise wherever we need to in cost, in AC, in handling? Do we need to put everything in glass, or can we get away with totes, or can we do a Mylar bag? And you do that through that R&D process, but you've got to add numbers to the subjective experience.
Right.
And that way, it's not really about judging with the numbers, it's about sorting. And then the judging can happen at the end to say, based on, my experience, I liked this, I liked this, I liked this. And then what is not that this is better or this is best, but that the thing I liked the most had these features. And so, it comes back to like, do you like blondes or brunettes? There isn't a better or a best, but there are many kinds of blonde and many kinds of brunette. And so if you know why you like a blonde or why you like a brunette, it's going to be easier for you to find the type you're looking for. The same is true with anything else that you can have a subjective opinion on. What you want to do is make your subjective opinion fully subjectively. That's like your blind, Pepsi challenge, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then you do need numbers behind that. If you do a blind Pepsi challenge, but you don't know which one was Coke or Pepsi, what was that? That was a regular cannabis sale. That's what we do. You try one, you see if you liked it, and then you can never try that same one again. And so it's useless. But what you need is to be able to have some numbers behind it to say, I don't know if it's because I don't like the sulfurs or the thiols, or if it's because I do love some of the fruitier, esters and other flavors, you don't really have to explain why. You can know what you like, and then you can know the features of it that help you track it down next time. And so it's kind of like knowing the weather. Some people find out the weather and they put on a jacket, and some people say, I can still get away with shorts today. You can all still be different, but at least we have a number that we're all sharing that you can interpret in a way that affects you, and so it gives you just a little bit more control over what you're going to do in response to, something we can now quantify and repeat.
So it would obviously add more cost to the extractor to test this, or maybe the cultivator.
Right. I'm asking for doubling the tests voluntarily.
Yeah, you're asking for doubling the tests.
The thing is, the expensive tests are the regulatory tests. So when the final product goes out to a third-party lab, they're going to be very careful, and they're going to do a lot of redundant testing, and they're going to charge more for that test. So a lot of people get it in their mind that, like, if it costs me $85 to get one heavy metal test on one sample, then why would I want to do that 2 more times in my process? And I would say because then you can see that the brass fittings you're using are leaching, and now we know, and you can stop causing the problem downstream. But, for everyone else, it's like, I don't want to test 3 times forever. Some of this you can test once or twice, find that you can repeat it, and then you don't ever have to do it again. But for the stuff you have to do all the time, like potency and like aromatic testing, it doesn't cost $80 to do it in-house. You'd have to buy equipment. A lot of times you can lease equipment, and you'd have to pay staff to run that equipment. But that is no different in terms of cost or investment than when you spend $100,000 on a vape filling machine, when you spend, a $500,000 on an extraction machine, and then you hired staff to run it and operate it. When you bring the analytics in-house, you will save money over time, especially because you will get better at your process. If you have to send out a test and it takes a week to get the potency results back to find out how much residual potency is left in your material, it's important to know you should still do that, but you probably have to throw that weed away and move on. You probably have more extracting to do. Whereas if I can go into the next room, submit a sample, and within 4 hours get that data back, I can literally go and extract the rest of it if I need to. I can,
So that analysis, like if you're the extractor receiving this and what you're starting with, like you said, like, what you're starting with at that point, and how you can, you can manipulate it in the extraction process to enhance things that you may not have thought, the percentage of certain terpenes or flavorants or whatever.
Right.
That's the idea.
Exactly. And there's a lot of ways to achieve it. So sometimes it's just pulling a sample very often and you send it off to test. So for example, you would do that like in a craft brewery or a winery, a distillation, for alcohol, where you have all these processes going and they can keep going or they can be stopped. And you pull a sample out, fill up a little vial, and you go check it. And you say, our sugar's here, our bricks is there, whatever. And then you decide what to do next. You can also, and this is more common in, for example, like dairy manufacturing, you can also have in-process sensors. So it might start with pulling samples, sending them out, and getting complex, redundant, expensive testing done to develop the process. And then now, because I've sent it out 10 times at each stage of my process, before and after, before and after, before and after, I'll know that if I ever drop, to warmer if my temperatures go above, let's say -30, and my pressure drops below this, that my quality is going to go down. And so I can put other sensors in place. So now I could just be using temperature loggers, pressure logging. You can have UV sensors and other types of detectors that are going to measure pigments. You can measure the density of your solvent. For butane and propane, you use a Coriolis meter that's going to measure the saturation of the solvent. So then I will know when I've finished extracting the material, because all that's coming through is solvent and there's nothing else dissolved in there. So you can use less precise equipment to verify your process after you've used more precise equipment to develop the process. Like R&D should be super expensive, very robust, lots of data collected so that all of those data points can be aggregated into like, here's where it matters the most. Here's the second thing that matters a lot. And if then, and if then, and if then, so that now in my actual process, I only have to measure, 3 to 5 things. And if all of those hit, I know exactly what my product is going to be. And if they don't, I know exactly when and where and why. And so it may not be the test before and after every run forever, but it might be a test before and after every time you get material from a new supplier or a new batch of solvent or a new piece of equipment or you train a new staff member. So, using whatever numbers are available to you that enable you to work backwards in proving a repeatable process to produce a subjective sensory experience for someone is going to enable you to run your business much tighter, because sometimes it is the material changed. Sometimes it is you have high turnover in the lab. And so every time someone's learning, as they learn, they're going to get better or worse at different stages of the process. Sometimes you can automate those stages where people have too much interaction out of the process to prevent that. But all of that comes from kind of collecting too much data up front, because if you find out at the end that all of these vape carts have pesticides in them, it's going to be much harder for you to go back and say, well, it's because this one time we mixed this one jar, it had the pesticides and it contaminated everything. If you didn't test every step, it's expensive to go back. And
Right.
you bear the cost up front or later.
Yeah, you need it. You need these steps along the way. Do you think that, like, to take us to the next level of product development in this area, that the extractors need, standards or a lexicon of
The lexicon of terminology is huge, right? So, we've been saying things like terpenes for a long time as if it explained the flavor, and it didn't, because nobody likes the smell of like just myrcene by itself. That's not what anyone recognizes as cannabis. It's part, but it's not all of it. And, then we throw out things like full spectrum, broad spectrum, whole plant, and they're just kind of meaningless. They don't quite define anything. And so, we do need a language that allows us to speak more clearly to each other, because for the consumer to see THCA hemp is very confusing when in the medical store, we are required to label it by the total potential THC, even if the product you're holding is THCA. Because the health and safety in the medical store is how much THC could you get? And in the hemp market, it's how much THC did we not get?
mhm.
And that is all a regulatory influence. Nobody wanted to communicate it that way. We are required to within like the market that we're given. And so what we have is this disjointed lexicon where the people in the medical world want to call it a different thing, and the people in the adult use world want to call it a different thing, and in the hemp world, they're going to call it a different thing. If we could use the same terms that mean the same things in as many observable and, sensory experiential characteristics as possible, that would be better for consumers. And then when consumers have the language to be able to ask us for what they actually want, we'd be able to modify our processes. Unfortunately, the regulation has gone the other way. It's come down, from regulation onto us and then to the consumer. And so that is a little bit backward. And because it's been so disjointed state by state, municipality by municipality, and again, with hemp, it's like Colorado, you can have CBD from hemp, but not the THCA from hemp, but it's the same businesses and they're just shipping it out and there's no,
Right.
it's very messy. So how could anyone be expected to know what's going on? But the standardization of how the processes are performed and how the testing is done, all of that, sort of happens on the sidelines. There's a lot of industry organizations and associations, and that's exactly what they do. I'm on a couple of work groups for the D37 group with ASTM, where we're just writing standards for cannabis.
Mhm.
And so when people reference things like these standards, some of the companies who write standards are pay-to-play organizations. Some of them are volunteer organizations. Some of them are a combination of both. But we're not the government. So what we are is people who say, I think it's important for you to clean your equipment in between batches. And I think that this is the amount of cleaning that's important to do. And everyone in the commercial food realm has a 3-compartment sink and their quaternary, sanitizers, and they have a standard. And so NSF is like one of those organizations. They come up with what they think food standards should be for surfaces and whatever, and you can comply with that or not. And maybe a regulatory body like the government could require you to comply with that standard, but a lot of these are just volunteer based. And so the issue with them being industry organizations is that we are bringing up the things that are important to us. And we have different perspectives than consumers, and consumers need to get in on it. I want a consumer on every one of those ASTM panels, because if you don't know anything about this process and you can read and understand that standard, that's a good standard.
Yeah, I guess, we just got to keep on trucking, and it's evolving, and we have so many different experts in different fields between the scientists and the extractors and the cultivators, everybody working together to try to, do the best. So, I just feel like what we talked about today, is the next level of pushing the envelope into the next better
and people as consumers have more access to the manufacturers of their products than ever before.
Yeah,
it is easier than it has ever been in history to reach out and get some information. So, if the labeling that you're seeing doesn't make sense, complain to your government. And, email the brands, but email your, local representatives, because everybody made a choice somewhere that contributed to the product you're holding. And so you can reach out to those people. Sometimes they're not going to change it for you, but this is where knowing your source can come into play, because sometimes it matters. Sometimes you can ask for an explanation and it'll, lead to a change that is relevant.
Thank you, Murphy. That was fantastic.